Imagine a time when radios crackled with Roosevelt's voice, when the clink of china in the parlor meant more than luxury, it meant pride, resilience, and middle-class dignity in a struggling world. This was 1930s America, deep in the shadow of the Great Depression. Yet in countless homes across the country, families didn't stop gathering. They dressed up, set the table with care, and served humble dinners with all the ceremony of a fine restaurant, right in their parlors. But what did they serve? What dishes filled those modest, lace-draped tables, recipes that disappeared quietly over the decades, buried under the weight of modern convenience? Tonight, we step into that forgotten dining room. We uncover 20 recipes that once defined middle-class comfort, dishes lost in time, now revived for your kitchen. From savory ham loaves with brown sugar glaze, to molded salads that jiggled their way into elegance, this is more than food. It's a rediscovery of the flavors that shaped an era. So grab your seat at the parlor table, because these 20 forgotten recipes are about to bring 1930s America back to life. And trust me, you've never seen dinner like this before. In a decade where every penny mattered, the American middle class didn't stop trying to make dinner feel like something special. And so emerged a dish that married economy with elegance, a forgotten classic from parlor tables across the 1930s, the savory ham loaf with brown sugar glaze. It wasn't quite meatloaf, and it wasn't quite ham steak. It was something else, something resourceful. Leftover ham scraps were ground and blended with pork, breadcrumbs, and fresh eggs, shaped into a loaf with the care of a Sunday roast. But the magic came from what was poured on top, a sweet, tangy glaze made of brown sugar, prepared mustard, and a splash of vinegar, brushed gently over the loaf before baking. As it roasted, the glaze would caramelize into a sticky, golden crust, giving off an aroma that could fill a parlor and stop conversations mid-sentence. Served in thick slices beside creamed peas or buttered carrots, this was the centerpiece of many modest yet dignified dinners, proof that even in hardship, families could dine with pride. But as the decades passed, this humble loaf was left behind, replaced by frozen meals and fast food shortcuts. Its name faded, its recipe forgotten. Until now. Because we're not just remembering what they ate, we're reviving how they lived, one bite at a time. In the 1930s, chicken was still a Sunday luxury, a symbol of comfort in uncertain times. But middle-class families knew how to stretch even the smallest bird into something special, and creamed chicken over cornbread rounds became one of their proudest creations. Picture this: tender bits of leftover chicken, simmered slowly in a rich, velvety white sauce, thickened with flour, butter, and whole milk from the morning delivery. Peas and carrots join the mix, adding soft color and texture, all folded gently into the creamy warmth, seasoned with nothing but salt, pepper, and a pinch of love. But the true foundation of this dish was golden cornbread, cut into neat rounds, toasted just enough to hold their shape under the weight of the sauce. It wasn't served on fine china. But when that ladle poured hot creamed chicken over those cornbread medallions, the meal felt rich, comforting, almost elegant. Served in parlors after church, or to guests on cool evenings, it was a dish that said, "We may not have much, but we still have grace." And yet, how easily it disappeared. Forgotten in the face of fast food, microwave dinners, and instant mixes. But tonight, it returns, not just as a recipe, but as a story of thrift, pride, and the quiet art of doing more with less. Creamed chicken over cornbread rounds, a dish from the past, ready for your table once again. Today, it might seem strange, even unsettling, a quivering ruby-red mold of tomato juice and gelatin, with a cool, creamy surprise in the center. But in the 1930s, tomato aspic salad wasn't a novelty. It was sophistication served cold. To the middle-class host or housewife, this dish was a showstopper, elegant, economical, and oh so modern. Made by simmering spiced tomato juice with a touch of vinegar, celery salt, and Worcestershire sauce. Then gently folding in unflavored gelatin, the mixture was poured into circular molds to set. And in the center, a scoop of cottage cheese, chilled to perfection, often mixed with diced green peppers or fresh herbs. Served on delicate lettuce leaves, perhaps with a sprig of parsley and a whisper of mayonnaise, it sat proudly on parlor tables as a first course, cool, savory, and a little theatrical. It was the kind of dish that said, "We read magazines. We entertain. We know style." But as the years passed and gelatin fell from culinary grace, the aspic quietly disappeared, dismissed as odd, even outdated. Its shimmer faded, and with it, a whole generation's pride in turning simplicity into spectacle. But tonight, the aspic jiggles once more, not as a joke, but as a celebration. Of care. Of creativity. Of a time when dinner had ceremony, even if it came from a tin and a packet of powder. Tomato aspic salad with cottage cheese center, forgotten no more. Not every 1930s dish was creamy or comforting. Some were cold, meticulous, and meant to impress, even when made on a modest budget. Enter the jellied veal loaf, a forgotten centerpiece of middle-class parlor dinners, once seen as the height of refined economy. It began with veal, poached slowly until tender, then finely minced and blended with just the right balance of celery, onion, and mild spices. To hold it all together? Not breadcrumbs, not eggs, but gelatin, made from the very broth the veal was simmered in. The mixture was poured into a long mold, packed tight, and left to chill overnight in the icebox. By dinner time, it emerged as a glossy, pale tranche, cool, firm, and sliceable like a delicate meat jelly. Served with sharp mustard, pickled onions, or a side of crisp cucumber salad, this loaf was not just food, it was a statement. Controlled, elegant, aspirational. To the modern eye, it may look strange, perhaps even unappetizing. But in the parlor tables of 1930s America, it was an achievement. A way to stretch a tough cut of meat into something dignified and deliberate. Yet as wartime shortages came and convenience foods rose, the jellied loaf vanished, and with it, the ritual of turning scraps into sculpture. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the soft clink of the mold releasing onto the platter, and the quiet pride of a hostess who made something from nearly nothing. Jellied veal loaf, a forgotten relic of careful hands and colder kitchens, back on the table where it belongs. In the world of 1930s middle-class cooking, few dishes blurred the lines between sweet and savory like this one. It was warm, golden, and fragrant, a dish that appeared at both holiday tables and Tuesday dinners, the forgotten scalloped pineapple casserole. At first glance, it confused the palate, canned pineapple chunks folded into buttery breadcrumbs, bound with beaten eggs and a touch of sugar, all baked into a soft, pudding-like casserole with a crisp, golden top. But beneath the sweetness lay a clever purpose. This wasn't dessert, it was a side dish. Served beside glazed ham, roast pork, or baked chicken, it brought balance and brightness to the plate. In an era when fresh produce was scarce and budgets tight, the canned pineapple, exotic, convenient, and shelf-stable, offered a hint of the tropics at a time when dreams of travel lived only in magazine ads. It was modern, a little risky, and it made a hostess feel like she had brought something daring to the table. But as cooking trends changed and pineapple fell out of favor, this casserole, once clipped from countless women's magazines, disappeared from the spotlight. Its unique blend of flavors, once seen as sophisticated, became misunderstood, then forgotten. But tonight we remember. We remember the pineapple in the pantry, the breadcrumbs in the tin, and the woman who turned them into something magical, something worthy of the parlor. Scalloped pineapple casserole, sweet, strange, and unapologetically 1930s. In the 1930s, dinner wasn't just about eating, it was about illusion, presentation, pride. And nothing captured that spirit quite like this cleverly named parlor favorite, mock duck. Despite the name, no duck was ever harmed or even involved. This was beef, humble and tough, transformed into something worthy of Sunday company. A thin cut of round steak was pounded flat, then spread with a savory stuffing, breadcrumbs, onions, herbs, maybe a touch of sage, and whatever leftovers were hiding in the icebox. Rolled tightly, tied with string, and slow braised in a rich brown gravy, the meat took on new life, tender, juicy, infused with the essence of the stuffing within. Once cooked, it was sliced into spirals, each slice revealing a swirl of flavor, like a poor man's roulade, elevated to something elegant. Why call it mock duck? Maybe it was the shape. Maybe the richness of the stuffing. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a quiet joke, a nod to dreams of luxury wrapped in thrift. To guests, it looked impressive. To hosts, it was a triumph, turning a cheap cut into a centerpiece with nothing more than time and know-how. But like many dishes of its era, mock duck faded away. Too slow for modern kitchens. Too humble for modern menus. Too clever for the microwave. But today we bring it back. Because mock duck was never just about meat, it was about making something beautiful when no one expected it. Mock duck, a dish of dignity, disguise, and delicious deception. In an era where refrigerators were new and canned goods were culinary gold, the middle-class parlor saw the rise of something cold, something clever, something pink. Deviled salmon molds, a forgotten gem from the 1930s, when entertaining meant impressing, even if you were working with rations. This dish started with a humble can of salmon, bones picked clean, flesh flaked gently into a bowl. But what came next wasn't ordinary. Hard-boiled eggs were mashed in, along with sharp mustard, lemon juice, paprika, and a dash of Worcestershire sauce, giving it that deviled kick, bold and tangy. To hold it all together? Unflavored gelatin, dissolved in warm broth, then stirred through the mixture like a magician's spell. It was poured into small individual molds, ramekins, teacups, or anything handy, and chilled until firm. The result? A delicate, savory salmon mousse that trembled ever so slightly on the plate, cool, smooth, and served with a whisper of horseradish cream or parsley garnish. For the 1930s hostess, it was sophistication in miniature. Easy to make ahead, beautiful to serve, and always met with quiet admiration. But as tastes changed and molded foods fell out of fashion, these little salmon sculptures vanished from our tables, dismissed as relics of a strange culinary age. Now we turn back the clock, and we remember the hostess who chilled her molds with care, who believed that canned salmon could be refined, and who knew that flavor had no class barrier. Deviled salmon molds, chilled, bold, and beautifully forgotten. Before box dinners, before fluorescent orange powders, there was this. A bubbling casserole, simple yet satisfying, baked macaroni with stewed tomatoes and cheese. A dish that filled both stomachs and silence in the parlor dining rooms of the 1930s. At its heart was elbow macaroni, boiled just tender, then layered with slow-stewed tomatoes, rich with onion, garlic, and a hint of butter or lard. No fancy sauces. No pre-shredded blends. Just chunks of sharp cheddar, grated by hand, tucked between the pasta and tomatoes, melting into golden patches as the dish baked to a crusty perfection. It was warmth on a plate. A meal that didn't try to be something it wasn't, and yet, it always left you feeling full, cared for, and strangely content. For middle-class families of the Great Depression, this was a comfort dish, affordable, meatless, and filling. It stretched ingredients and brought people together. Children loved it. Grandparents trusted it. And for the cook, it was one of the few recipes that needed no exact measurements, just instinct and a little love. But over the decades, as convenience claimed the kitchen, this casserole was pushed aside, replaced by boxed shortcuts and drive-through dinners. Today, we bake it again, slowly, deliberately, not just to taste the past, but to feel it. Because sometimes, the simplest things are the ones worth remembering. Baked macaroni with stewed tomatoes and cheese, the casserole that never tried too hard and never had to. In the hands of a 1930s home cook, even a plain eggplant could become something worthy of the parlor. Stuffed eggplant with savory mince wasn't just a recipe, it was transformation, a show of skill, and a declaration that beauty could come from the most unlikely places. The eggplants were halved, scooped carefully, their purple shells saved like little boats. The flesh was chopped and sautéed with onion, garlic, and ground beef, or whatever meat scraps the icebox allowed. Seasoned with a pinch of nutmeg, fresh herbs if available, and a spoonful of tomato paste for richness, the mixture simmered until fragrant. Then, the savory mince was spooned back into its original shell, crowned with breadcrumbs and a dusting of sharp cheese. Into the oven it went, baking until the tops turned golden and the aroma pulled the family to the table. To the untrained eye, it was just an eggplant. But to the 1930s hostess, it was a meal elevated. A centerpiece made not with money, but with mastery. Vegetables weren't side dishes here, they were the stars. Carriers of flavor. Canvases of creativity. And though stuffed eggplant would linger in immigrant kitchens, it quietly vanished from middle-class American tables as the decades turned, seen as too odd, too laborious, too old-fashioned. But today, we stuff it once again. We honor the hands that didn't waste a single scrap, and the minds that turned humble ingredients into heartfelt meals. Stuffed eggplant with savory mince, elegant, efficient, and proudly forgotten. To some, it was a challenge. To others, comfort. But in the 1930s, liver and bacon with onions was more than a meal. It was a necessity dressed in dignity. Beef or calf liver, sliced thin, soaked in milk to soften the bitter edges, was pan-seared quickly in a hot skillet. Then came the onions, caramelized low and slow, until they turned golden, soft, and sweet as syrup. And then, the bacon. Crisp, smoky, and unapologetically rich. It wasn't just garnish, it was the flavor anchor. Layered together on a modest plate, the dish delivered boldness and balance. The metallic edge of liver, the sweetness of onion, the crunch of bacon, all working in harmony. For the middle-class American family of the 1930s, liver wasn't strange, it was smart. It was affordable, nutritious, and packed with iron. Doctors recommended it. Mothers praised it. Children tolerated it. But it was the onions and bacon that made it shine, turning a necessity into something almost indulgent. As meat became more available and tastes shifted, liver faded into obscurity. Today, it's more memory than meal, often joked about, rarely cooked. But back then, it stood proudly at the center of many weeknight tables. Because feeding a family wasn't about preference, it was about perseverance. Liver and bacon with onions, a forgotten flavor of strength, served with a side of sweetness and survival. It was humble. It was hearty. And for millions of Americans, it was unforgettable. Creamed chipped beef on toast points, a dish born in army kitchens, but adopted into the heart of middle-class homes during the 1930s. It began with dried beef, thin ribbons of salty, preserved meat, pulled from a jar or package. In a time before refrigeration was reliable, this beef was dependable and intense. The strips were rinsed, then quickly sautéed in butter, just long enough to bring their savory edge to life. A roux was made, flour browned in the fat, and milk poured in slowly, creating a silky white sauce that thickened with patience. The beef was folded in, the sauce simmered, and the smell? Nutty. Familiar. But it wasn't just ladled onto a plate. No, in 1930s parlor dinners, it was served with style. Poured gently over crisp toast points, diagonally cut triangles, perfectly browned, stacked like edible architecture. It was creamy, crunchy, comforting. A dish that felt both indulgent and efficient. For many families, it was a favorite, especially when meat was scarce and pennies were tight. And for those who had served in the military, it was nostalgia on a plate. Yes, it later earned an unprintable nickname in the barracks, but in the home, it was respected, honored, remembered. Today, we pour it again, thick and steaming, onto toast made not just with bread, but with memory. Creamed chipped beef on toast points, salty, smooth, and straight from America's forgotten pantry. There were dishes for feeding the family, and then there were dishes for impressing the guests. Chicken à la king, rich, velvety, and spooned into golden pastry shells, was one of the most elegant offerings to ever grace a 1930s parlor dinner. It started with leftover chicken, often from a Sunday roast, chopped and simmered in a cream sauce made with butter, flour, and milk. But this wasn't just cream and chicken. It was elevated with diced pimentos, tender mushrooms, sweet peas, and a touch of sherry or chicken stock for depth. The result? A silky, savory stew with royal flavor. hence the name. But what made it a showstopper wasn't just the filling, it was the vessel. Flaky, buttery puff pastry shells, baked until golden, hollowed to hold that creamy crown. On the plate, it looked luxurious, delicate pastry rising above the sauce, steam curling into the air, the promise of richness in every bite. For middle-class hostesses in the 1930s, this was a statement dish, a way to serve leftovers without shame. A dish that said, "We may not be wealthy, but we know how to dine." It was a regular feature at bridal showers, church luncheons, and afternoon teas, refined, filling, and practical. But as fast food rose and shortcuts ruled, this royal dish quietly lost its throne, too fussy, too formal for modern tastes. But tonight, we serve it again, with pride. Because chicken à la king wasn't just about the flavor, it was about the feeling. Chicken à la king in pastry shells, creamy, classy, and cooked to impress. In the 1930s, vegetables weren't just boiled and forgotten, they were carved, buttered, and beautifully dressed. Take the parsnip, a pale root often overshadowed by the potato. But in middle-class parlors, it was given a moment to shine, shaped into rings, bathed in butter, and served with a fragrant herb sauce. Parsnips were peeled, sliced into thick coins, and cored into delicate rings, a small act of transformation that turned something rustic into something refined. Gently simmered until tender, then sautéed in golden butter until their edges caramelized, the rings took on a sweetness almost like honeyed carrots, but with earthier depth. But the real secret was the herb sauce, a warm blend of parsley, thyme, tarragon, and a touch of vinegar or lemon, whisked into melted butter or cream. It draped over the rings like a soft blanket of flavor. To the 1930s hostess, this wasn't just a side dish. It was proof of care, of intention, a vegetable made lovely, because every part of the meal mattered. Children might not have known the names of the herbs. Guests might not have asked. But everyone tasted the difference. Today, parsnips are barely mentioned, relegated to soup stocks or holiday roasts. But once, they sat proudly on polished tables, sweet, savory, and shaped with quiet elegance. We bring them back not for novelty, but for memory. Because even a simple root, when treated with love, can become something worth remembering. Buttered parsnip rings with herb sauce, carved with care, dressed with dignity, and long forgotten by most. In the 1930s, if it shimmered, jiggled, or sparkled under the chandelier light, it belonged at the parlor table. Molded fruit salad with mayonnaise glaze wasn't just a dish, it was a centerpiece. A glistening dome of gelatin, packed with canned fruits, peaches, pineapple chunks, maraschino cherries, and crisp celery, suspended in a clear, sweet swirl. To modernize, it might look like dessert. But back then, this was a salad, a savory sweet creation meant to cleanse the palate and impress the guests. But the boldest move? The glaze. A smooth layer of whipped mayonnaise, often sweetened just slightly or mixed with cream, poured gently over the top, creating a glossy, tangy finish. Served in slices like a cake, each bite was a surprise. Soft fruit, cold jelly, a crunch of celery, and that unmistakable zing from the mayo. For 1930s hostesses, this was more than food. It was presentation. Proof that you had style, and access to canned goods and gelatin, both symbols of modern convenience. Children were fascinated. Some guests hesitated, but no one ever forgot it. As the decades passed, molded salads like this became punchlines, relics of a time when culinary fashion outpaced flavor. But if you look closely, you'll see something beautiful, a dish that tried to be both art and nourishment. A recipe that held together more than fruit, it held a moment in time. Molded fruit salad with mayonnaise glaze, jiggly, joyful, and unapologetically vintage. There was a time when thrift and elegance weren't opposites, they were partners. And no dish proved that better than sweetbread croquettes. Sweetbreads, not a dessert, but the delicate thymus or pancreas of a young calf, were once a prized ingredient. Soft, rich, and buttery in texture, they were the caviar of resourceful cooks. In the 1930s, housewives didn't waste such delicacies, they transformed them. First, the sweetbreads were soaked, then gently poached in seasoned water until tender. Next came the chopping and the folding into a velvety bechamel sauce enriched with a hint of nutmeg, parsley, and sometimes a dash of sherry. The mixture was cooled, shaped into cylinders or small ovals, then rolled in egg and breadcrumbs. Fried until golden and crisp on the outside, but creamy and luxurious on the inside, these croquettes were a marvel of texture and flavor. Served on fine china, sometimes with a ribbon of lemon butter or a parsley cream, they were the highlight of parlor dinners. Guests often didn't even ask what was inside, they just knew it tasted refined. To cook sweetbreads well required technique. And to serve them? Confidence. But as American tastes shifted and processed foods took over, sweetbreads became rare, first unfamiliar, then unwelcome. Now, even the name brings hesitation. But back then, these golden croquettes were a symbol of pride, precision, and making the most of what you had. And for the skilled home cook, they were a badge of honor. Sweetbread croquettes, forgotten, misunderstood, and once the crown jewel of the middle-class parlor plate. In a time when salads meant more than lettuce, Celery Victor stood tall, crisp, cold, and quietly refined. Born in San Francisco in the early 1900s and popularized in American parlors by the 1930s, this dish took an overlooked vegetable, celery, and treated it like royalty. The stalks were trimmed, blanched briefly in boiling water, then plunged into an ice bath, locking in their crunch and vibrant green color. Then came the marinade, a delicate broth of beef or chicken stock, mingled with white wine vinegar, olive oil, black pepper, and a whisper of mustard. The celery bathed in it for hours, sometimes overnight, soaking up that savory tang until every bite was bright and tender. Served chilled, often with red pimentos, parsley sprigs, or hard-boiled egg slices, Celery Victor was a show of culinary restraint and quiet glamour. It wasn't flashy. It didn't jiggle. But it stood proudly beside the molded salads and creamed entrees, the cool, clean note in a warm, heavy meal. For middle-class families aiming for elegance, it was a mark of taste, subtle, surprising, and served with tongs on crystal platters. But like many refined dishes, Celery Victor faded, too simple, too quiet for modern times. Yet when chilled celery meets savory marinade and memory meets flavor, something timeless returns to the table. Celery Victor, crisp, composed, and crowned with history. Wrapped, rolled, and slow-cooked to perfection, cabbage rolls told a story at every table, of frugality, flavor, and family. In 1930s America, as immigrant recipes blended into the fabric of middle-class cooking, this humble Eastern European dish was given a parlor-worthy makeover. Boiled cabbage leaves, soft and pliable, were carefully filled with a savory mixture of ground beef, rice, onion, and herbs. Each roll tucked tight, like a small edible package of care. But what made the dish truly shine was the sauce. Not just tomato, but tomato cream. A silky blend of canned tomatoes, a touch of sugar, and rich sour cream or heavy cream, simmered until tangy and smooth. As the cabbage rolls baked in this velvety bath, the flavors melded. The cabbage softened further. The rice swelled. The meat became tender and infused with that sweet tart creaminess. By the time they were pulled from the oven, the casserole dish bubbled like a warm promise. Served with mashed potatoes or buttered noodles, this was more than a meal, it was a hug from the oven. To middle-class families in the 30s, cabbage rolls were practical, but dressed in tomato cream, they were elevated. Not just for survival, but for comfort, for presentation, for pride. These aren't just recipes, they're a reminder of how our grandparents turned hardship into hospitality. So if you felt the warmth in these forgotten dishes and want to rediscover more meals that shaped America's tables, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Because the past still speaks to us, you just have to taste it to hear it. And maybe, just maybe, in remembering their meals, we remember their resilience.